Hello again. In this last section, what I want to do is to try to address the question of whether we're better off regarding nationalism as a cause or a consequence of political events. And I want to do this by examining some of the dimensions of what we can call the long 1990s, that is to say, the continued and continuing influence of the regimes that came to power in the 1990s, that is at the end of the socialist period in Southeast Europe, and of the violence that was produced by these regimes and their continued importance 30 years after the beginning of this period. So I think that part of trying to develop an answer means taking on a lot of questions that are unresolved. And this means that a lot of what I will be saying will not so much be answering questions as raising them. First, it might be important to look at some possible alternative explanations for the long 1990s. What is it that happened and what accounts for its power? This is a non-exhaustive list of some of the dominant explanations that are offered for the emergence of the regimes of the 1990s. Answer number one is that it is a delayed transition. That is, what is represented by these regimes is a failed effort at the end of the communist period to establish liberal democratic states that would be relatively well functioning, so that a series of transitional modes of rule appeared and did not leave. At some point, of course, we have to raise the question of whether 30 years of transition might mean that we are not talking about a transition, but about something permanent. If we are talking about something permanent, what is it? One possible theory is, this is a phrase that is taken from the work of Sigmund Freud, that what's represented here is the return of the repressed. The return of the repressed in this case would be national conflict, national hatred, national intolerance, nationalism. The basic hypothesis here is that communist regimes managed to keep national contention and conflict and the potential for violence under control, and that once they lost power, these forces re-emerged, possibly spontaneously, and became dominant ever since. Advancing this theoretical explanation requires making a number of assumptions, one of which was that the repressed was always there. That is, that the potential for nationalist conflict was always present and was only kept in check by strong exercise of political power. And that means, on the level of assumption, rejecting the explanation that national conflict and eventually national violence was produced by conditions. That is to say, this explanation is a little bit fraught. A third explanation might be that new political forms emerged in the 1990s that proved to be stable. What do we call these forms? A number of people have talked about different kinds of democracies with adjectives: hybrid democracy, centralized democracy, ethnic democracy, limited democracy, and so on. I have proposed in some places the term nationalist authoritarian. Some people have picked up parts of this, and some people have picked up others, with an emphasis on national or with an emphasis on authoritarian. The basic hypothesis, though, is that a new form of regime, or relatively new form of regime, emerged during this time, and it remained in power, it remained stable. A fourth explanation is that states were captured. Who were they captured by? There's a variety of ways in which this is posed. Parts of intelligence or security services, ideological nationalists, members of old political elites seeking to remain in power. The state capture explanation inevitably contains some elements of conspiracy theory, and it's a decision that you have to make how much of this you want to accept, how much of it you want to reject. In applying these explanations, we also need to account for violence. How do we account for violence in this period that we're talking about? First of all, by raising some questions. Was the violence spontaneous, or was it planned? Was it the work of a group of people, or was the potential for it always present in the environment? Second, we ask, was the violence popular? Of course, violence is never popular, but were the political projects that produced violence supported by large numbers of people, and was violence accepted as a more or less unavoidable or inevitable consequence of these projects? An alternative explanation within this is that violent projects may not have been popular at the time that they were engaged, but became popular or were legitimated afterward in public opinion. Here is Stanislav to help me talk about violence to you. A third question is whether violence was avoidable, and then if we argue that it was avoidable, can we explain the fact that it was nonetheless not avoided? One thing that we can be certain about is that violence had long-term consequences. That is, violence had consequences for political development in terms of forming the type of regime that would take power and the type of elite that would form, and violence had consequences for economic development, particularly in terms of placing barriers in the potential to form relations between people that would normally tend to result in relationships of labor and of trade. Uh, in talking about effects of violence, we also probably need to talk about the effects of agreements and other arrangements that put an end to violence. In every case of violence in Southeast Europe, there was some kind of peace agreement that resulted in agreements for some type of power sharing. Croatia may be an exception where there was a military victory, but otherwise in Macedonia, in Kosovo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you saw the development of some kind of consociational relationship in which power would be shared by groups that are defined by ethnic qualifiers. And this sharing of power meant a couple of things. One of the things that it meant is that the groups that were seen as the warring parties became the parties exercising power afterward. The second is that international institutions established through some kind of agencies or directly, that is through high representatives or directly through institutions like NATO or the European Union, they became the guarantors of agreements, meaning that there was a level of oversight over the behavior of all of the states in the region. Now, placing the warring parties in political power at the end of the conflict meant that it was difficult to break from the perceptions and arguments that accounted for violence in the first place. Instead, the groups that had legitimated their power engaged in ideological work to justify the reasons for engaging in violence, to deny acts of violence or interpretations of violence that were committed. A further possible consequence of peace agreements is that in most cases agreements were conditioned on or established as a condition the holding of elections after the signing of an agreement. In most of these cases, not all of them, some kind of opposition party or opposition coalition came into power, or parties or coalitions describing themselves at least as democratic, and most of these oppositional coalitions lasted a short time, fell apart, were replaced by representatives of the group that had been in power at the time of the violence, some sort of manifestation of these. So we need to account for the uncertain character of democratically organized opposition and for the persistence of the parties that established themselves through a willingness to engage in violence. And we also need to account for the relative instability or difficulties with legitimation faced by the regimes that came to establish themselves in these positions. That is to say, we can talk about long-term consequences of the regimes and violence of the 1990s in some general categories. We can talk about long-term effects in the field of culture, and in particular in the creation of new cultural divisions and their enforcement and the resistance to the establishment of these divisions and their enforcement. We can talk about consequences on the level of civil society, and in particular on the relationship between civil societies and states, particularly in those states that tend to regard at least a portion of the civil society as potential opponents and enemies, as people who will be described in official rhetoric as betraying or opposing or insulting the national community. And we can talk about consequences in terms of political development, and in particular in terms of the fear that is associated with acknowledgement of the past. In addition to talking about long-term effects on the institution level. We can talk about long-term effects on the demographic level in terms of population. Um, One of the results of the violence of the 1990s is that populations have changed. The structure of populations have changed through the displacement of people, through the creation of refugees, through migration. And one of the ways in which it has changed is to create communities that are more receptive to nationalist appeals than the communities that existed before. It is the establishment of relatively homogeneous communities in places where communities had before the violence been diverse. And what this probably has as a consequence is a closing of the ranks around contests of memory, the feeling that something is at stake in memory, and an encouragement of the perception that members of rival national and ethnic groups are potential aggressors, that members of the reference group with which a person identifies are potential victims. So these we can think of as long-term consequences. They refer back to a lot of the main themes that we want to take on in this seminar. Trying to account for the rise of national movements and the unfinished construction of national identities, unfinished or even never begun projects of reconciliation and promotion of mutual understanding. We can talk about issues that are unresolved from previous experience, in particular from the Second World War and from the period of imperial rule. We can talk about ongoing dispute over the legacy of communist rule and the meaning of this legacy, and we can talk about long-term, what appear to be permanent and endemic issues of legitimacy and stability. Where does this all leave us? Can we offer any conclusions on the basis of this? I think it is possible that I may not have many conclusions to offer right now, except to say that approaching the question of nationalism, of the consequences of nationalism, of accounting for nationalism, raises a lot of open questions, raises a lot of open themes that we need to continue discussing, which I hope we'll be able to do in our discussion this week and in the following weeks.